I should say, firstly, that this is part of a kind of bigger area of research that I'm just embarking on at the moment, really. I'm working on a book which is about travel journalism and the way in which travel journalism has kind of shifted from its kind of traditional print origins into kind of multi-platform social media contexts, and also in terms of a shift into other genres. So we now find, quite commonly, motoring programs that involve some aspect of kind of travel, or TV celebrity chefs involved in travel, or whatever it might be. So there is this kind of shift of travel-related media emerging, and it's quite a big area. And so for the purposes of today's presentation, I thought I would focus on a very specific niche within all of this, which is motorcycle adventure, travel writing and travel journalism. And I'm interested in the way in which various communities have kind of sprung up around this activity, both online and in kind of print forms. There's a long history to this sort of writing, going back to the early kind of 1900s. And this book came out in 1935. It's about two women who travelled through Central Africa with a motorbike and a sidecar and a trailer as well. So there's a kind of real long trajectory to this type of writing. And I'm not really going to go into too much depth on that today, but what I want to do is just to identify a very kind of key sort of seminal work within all of this, which is a book by Ted Simon called Jupiter's Travels. This came out in 1978 and was the kind of culmination, really, of a 4.5-year round-the-world 64,000 mile journey that he took on. He was sponsored by the Sunday Times to do it. He was a kind of freelance journalist before embarking on this trip, and he continued to publish articles throughout his trip. And I'm drawing attention to him, really, because this book is revered both within the sort of more niche motorcycle press, but also more broadly within travel writing as a kind of modern minor classic, if you like. And again, there's a huge amount that could be said about this book. It's very interesting, as I say, not just for motorcyclists, but also for travel writing more generally. But I want to here just draw attention to three kind of characteristics of his writing, three modes of representation, if you like, of his writing. And I want to use those really to make an argument about the way in which they became the kind of building blocks of a kind of, to put it in sort of Bourdieu's terms, a sort of habitats really for modern motorcycle adventure travel, the way in which it's written about and the activity as it is actually practiced. So I'm just drawing attention to three things very briefly. That I'm not really exploring them in huge depth here, but the first thing to say is that he took a very kind of simplistic, kind of homespun approach to his journey. You can see here he's dressed in an old bomber jacket, wearing jeans, got some luggage on the back of his bike, and that's kind of about it. And even when he reenacted the journey in 2001 at the age of 70, he's looking fairly kind of similar. He's not looking particularly kind of high tech in his kind of approach. Two other things that are quite significant about the way in which he engages with all of this. Firstly, he very much lets the journey kind of unfold around him. And it's a bit of a kind of cliche in a way, but he doesn't let the kind of road become a means to an end. He lets the road kind of take him where it might take him. And so his book is full of kind of happenstance, things unfolding in very kind of natural, organic sorts of ways. And he uses the motorbike very much, as I think hopefully this quote perhaps illustrates, to facilitate kind of cultural engagement and interaction. He describes how obviously you can travel around the world in less than 48 hours, but really to experience it, you've got to get the bugs in your teeth and get out there and actually engage with what's kind of going on. Now this kind of really captured the imagination, not just of the kind of niche of the motorcycle press, But as I say, it was, it gained considerable kind of critical acclaim. Magazines like Wanderlust call Ted Simon the godfather of motorcycle adventure travel. There have been lots of articles written about him in more mainstream newspapers, describing the way he inspired lots of others to do similar kinds of journeys and so on. So these three kinds of modes of representation, I think then, if we can kind of jump forwards slightly chronologically into the 1980s and 1990s, get taken up by two kind of key exponents within this kind of activity. The first is Chris Scott, who's published about 5 books, mainly on travelling in the Sahara, and a lot of them are kind of almost bordering on kind of manuals for kind of desert travel and so on. The other person is Austin Vince, who produced 2 documentaries that were shown on Channel 4 in the 1990s and early 2000s. He travelled around the world in 1995-96 and again in 2001. Now, these guys very much, as I hope, and this is slightly cut off, but I hope you can just see just from these kind of pictures here, they very much kind of embrace the aesthetic that Ted Simon, kind of achieved in this image. Now, I'm not necessarily saying Ted Simon set out to, present himself in this kind of rugged yet kind of glamorous sort of way, but I think that image kind of really captured something in the public's imagination, and it's no mistake that these guys are kind of using a similar sort of approach. More than that, though, if you look more closely at their work, they too are very much engaged in this idea of using the motorcycle as a kind of cultural facilitator, as a means of kind of engaging with people and places more broadly. So what I want to kind of suggest here is that they take on these kind of tools, if you like, that Ted Simon proffered in Jupiter's Travels, and out of that starts to emerge this kind of series of schemas, a kind of series of practices, a kind of habitats, if you like, that enables this activity to kind of function around a series of kind of rules of engagement, if you like. So just fast forwarding to the early 2000s, we find, as I'm sure you've probably no doubt seen, maybe even watched them on TV, Ewan McGregor and his better known friend Charlie Boorman doing their long way round trip and various other subsequent follow-ups to that. Their first trip was done in 2004, and it was UK to the US to New York via Russia. They were under a very tight schedule. Ewan McGregor was, I think, in the middle of lots of films and had to kind of do the trip quite quickly. They had a huge amount of kind of equipment with them, 2 backup cars, a doctor, all sorts of things, an office back in London with people who were arranging visas for them so that when they got to the next border crossing they could go straight through and so on. They meet Ted Simon, now in his 70s, on his reenactment of his first journey in Mongolia, and there is mention of it in both the book and in the TV series. And I think what's quite interesting is on the one hand they acknowledge that their trip is quite different and that they've got lots of support and they're under quite a tight schedule. But you've only got to look at the front cover of their book, and again, images like this in their book, to see that they kind of very much buy into this aesthetic that Ted Simon kind of originally created. It's a very washed out image. You wouldn't necessarily know which decade this image was from. If you happen to be a motorcycle geek, the bikes will kind of give it away a bit. But that's about it really, in terms of identifying the time frame of this. And they talk about how in the end it all came back to just the 2 of us, 2 average guys on their bikes. But of course they're not average guys on their bikes, they're multi-millionaires with a huge amount of equipment. But Ted Simon, being kind of included in all of this, lends a degree of expertise to them, and lends them a degree of perhaps cultural capital, you could argue. And I think what emerges is these 2 become the kind of cultural intermediaries for this type of activity. they bring it to the public's attention more broadly, and they become kind of authorities of legitimation. So what was something that was very niche and very specialised, and one man in a shed building his bike and disappearing off to Mongolia for 3 months or something, suddenly becomes, oh yeah, you mean like Ewan and Charlie? Oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I know what you mean by that. So they kind of lend all of this a degree of legitimation. But what happens, I think, as a result of that is quite interesting. If we look online and we look at the more kind of specialised forums, blogs and so on that emerge in this kind of motorcycling fraternity, we see several things kind of going on. On the one hand, there's a massive rise of, bikes, gear, all sorts of things, and all of that is driven very much by Ewan and Charlie and the kind of publicity developed there. But there is also a kind of significant rise in communities of very genuine, or much more genuine, people involved in these kinds of activities. And not only are they now just individuals going off and doing these things, they're individuals who can kind of share their experiences, share their identity stories, if you like. So there's quite a bit of variation in styles and practice, but this kind of approach that Ted Simon started off with remains quite dominant and quite significant. And it becomes really the means by which cultural capital is gained for those who are online operating in these sorts of areas. I'll just very briefly draw your attention to a couple of kind of key words that have kind of come up around this kind of subcultural thing. One which I particularly like is farkle. I don't know if people have come across this before, but it's a combination of function and sparkle. So you can farkle your bike, which means to kind of make it very functional, but also to kind of give it some sparkle, give it some kind of uniqueness in a way. I think these words, like many other subcultures, become kind of linguistic kind of gatekeepers, if you like. So if they're used correctly, if they're used appropriately, they allow people access to these particular forums. But if they're used in an overblown way or an incorrect way, they become things that people are kind of perhaps rejected or the subject of derision as a result. So you have this kind of huge burst in all of this sort of thing happening through the early 2000s towards the kind of present day online. And I think what happens as a result of that, if we think about that perhaps in a kind of, using some Bourdieu's concepts, is we have this kind of means by which symbolic mastery can kind of be displayed through things like online forums. But who the expert is becomes a much more kind of fluid and contested sort of space. So to win distinction in this kind of area becomes quite problematic and kind of interesting, I suppose, in a way. So on the one hand, you have bikers such as this one here saying, I've just watched The Long Way Around and I'm disgusted by it. It should be retitled How Not to Ride Around the World Unless You're a Millionaire. And he's really kind of angry that these people are kind of faking something that is much more kind of pure and much more kind of authentic than Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman managed to achieve. On the other hand, you have other bikers online saying things like, Long Way Round was great for biking in general. It gave much publicity to a kind of much maligned and misunderstood activity. So these guys should get our kind of support. So if you think about that in terms of the general public, Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman are kind of displaying this kind of mastery of this activity. The general public see them as kind of experts in this kind of area. The hardcore bikers see them as fakers who've kind of stolen some expertise from them, from people like Ted Simon. So this notion of mastery gets kind of pulled in lots of different areas. But ironically, for the average biker, suddenly they gain some cultural capital perhaps through all of this, because they can explain what they do to the average person in terms that they will understand. Oh, it's like Ewan McGregor and Charlie Boorman. Is that what you kind of do? Oh yeah, okay, I understand. So it gives them some kind of cultural capital. So I think there's this kind of interesting shift between celebrity-driven bikers in the kind of mainstream media and what's kind of going on online in more kind of specialist forums. So I think if we kind of take some of these ideas and think about them more generally, I think social media perhaps offers travel journalism a means by which it can become perhaps slightly more loosely connected with a more kind of commercial drive. If you think about more traditional forms of travel journalism, it's basically, you know, I'm here to sell you a holiday. Read this article and you will love to go to Rome or wherever it might be. And there's a very one-way kind of transaction going on there. You acquire cultural capital by identifying with what's on offer and buying into that particular notion. Now, in this particular forum, that's less of the case. It's still there. You can still pay for a holiday to go off adventure biking and all the rest of it. But there are lots of kind of forums and online communities that you can tap into that say, no, you don't need to do all of that. You alone can do that, and you can gain some sort of cultural capital by sharing your experience with other bikers. So there is no longer necessarily that imperative to gain cultural capital through a kind of more commercial drive. And interestingly, people like Austin Vince, who I mentioned earlier, has just recently brought out a film which is very much a kind of manual on how to go off on a very limited budget and have this kind of experience in that sort of a way. So there is a kind of interesting shift in that kind of way. I think also social media provides the possibility for a more kind of democratised notion of expertise. That, you know, who is the expert? It's not necessarily the kind of professional travel journalist. Or even somebody like Ewan McGregor. It can be pretty much anybody, and that is quite an interesting kind of development to kind of explore. So I think if we just think about that in terms of travel journalism very generally, we can see this kind of more fluid notion of expertise perhaps emerging. But I think if we just return briefly to travel journalism and in particular motorcycle adventure travel, we can see something happening more specific. I think Jupiter's Travels kind of functions as a sort of much more mythologized text by which individuals can kind of gain legitimacy, can gain distinction by aligning themselves with some of those kind of modes of representation that Ted Simon began to kind of initiate. So I think in a way his practical and symbolic mastery become kind of facilitators, really, through which all other stories need to pass in some way. They're almost like kind of filters through which other stories can pass. And if those stories kind of successfully negotiate their way through those filters, then I think it's kind of possible for a kind of more purified identity story to emerge. So there is this kind of sense by which this seminal text has kind of come to function as a way of defining the kind of habitus of this activity. And in doing that, I think it perhaps gives us an indication of what is happening more broadly to travel journalism as it is shifting online. And you've got all sorts of blending now of different people writing online, from professional travel journalists to amateurs, and this notion of expertise becomes much more kind of fluid and contested as a result. So I'm going to stop.